34:29 to 35. It is about when Moses had a radiant face. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands, he was not aware that his face was radiant, because he had spoken with the Lord. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, his face was radiant, and they were afraid to come near him. But Moses called to them, so Aaron and all the leaders of the community came back to him, and he spoke to them. Afterward, all the Israelites came near him, and he gave them all the commands the Lord had given him on Mount Sinai. When Moses finished speaking to them, he put a veil over his face. But whenever he entered the Lord's presence to speak with him, he removed the veil until he came out. And when he came and told the Israelites what he had been commanded, they saw that his face was radiant. Then Moses would put the veil back over his face until he went in to speak with the Lord. And our New Testament reading will be Matthew 17, 1 through 13. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah, talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud enveloped them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The disciples asked him, "Why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. I was looking into continuing my study of Lent, and it seems as though the main topic of conversation for today would be the Transfiguration, which last week we were looking more at the 40 days of the temptation of Jesus in the desert, and today we move to the Transfiguration. And it's interesting how you see a couple of different theories on the whole meaning of the Transfiguration, but the one thing that I thought was very interesting is how when Moses was talking to God, he came down and he was so radiant. And then at this time, you could see that Jesus was talking to God, that God came in the cloud. And the one thing that's really interesting to me is that they don't mention that Elijah is radiant. They don't mention that Moses is radiant. They don't mention that Peter, James, or John are radiant, even though all these people were in the cloud. But they do mention that Jesus was radiant. And to me, from all the studying and thoughts that I could come up with, and I always say I don't preach my opinion, but I'm trying not to preach my opinion, but it seems like there has to be some symbolism of before people were to listen to Moses, because God gave him the direction, God talked to him face to face, and taught him, and educated him, and told him what he needed to pass on to the Jewish community. And then we look at Jesus, and God says how he is very well pleased with his Son, and listened to him. So now, and he's also radiant, which in the readings that I did, in my mind, it became more of the concept that, kind of like with Moses, how he had something to pass on with the Old Testament, here we get to see the beginning of the New Testament, the beginning of the New Covenant, in that Jesus had something relevant to teach, just like Moses had something relevant to teach. He was radiant from being with God, and here was Jesus being radiant, and he had something of importance to teach us, and something that God gave him that we needed to listen to. And God made that quite clear. Listen to him. And the whole idea, especially for Peter, James, and John, to us, it may not mean that much to have Moses and Elijah there. But these were pretty much the two greatest Jews that they had. And for them to be able to come and be talking to Jesus, to them would have been like a super revolutionary right off the beginning. Well, obviously, you're standing there looking at Moses and Elijah. So, I mean, that's just mind-blowing right off the start. But here we are with Moses and Elijah. And Peter is like so worked up, he's like, oh, let's build you guys someplace to stay for a little while. I mean, he was like totally missed the whole concept. And it's funny that the Bible includes things like that, because it shows how in our humanity we can be in such a situation as that, and the first thing that we think of is, let's build him a house or a tent or whatever he was planning on building them. And it shows just to me, it shows the humanity that Peter had. And yes, they did kneel down and everything, but he was more worried about building them someplace to stay for a little while. So it's always interesting how people can think in certain situations and whatnot. And to me, it's very interesting how the Bible even includes such things to show us. Sometimes we can see something from God and we miss the point. And we're like, maybe I can do this, or maybe I can do that. And it's like, here you got Jesus transfiguring. And the funny thing is that the transfiguring, I kind of diverge here, but for quite a while I was on a thing to explain it like a 4-year-old. And actually, I started reading about how to explain this to 4-year-olds. And it's kind of funny, because they basically say, just explain that Jesus was shining bright, and his face was shining bright, and his clothing was really white and shining, and that was the transfiguring. And, it seems like there's not a whole lot to it. But when you look at the Bible and you look at the last time that it happened, and you see that God enveloped them in the cloud, to me it shows the purpose that God was really saying to these guys, these 3 guys who were basically the leaders of the disciples, besides for Jesus, but the most influential of them. He was saying, this is it. This is the man. Peter had already said he is the Son of God. And this is kind of like God saying, well, he does say, this is my son. To me, he's kind of like giving them the kick, the boot, the strength, the power that God confirms this. It's not just Peter thinking it, but God is actually confirming. Peter said this, Jesus agreed with him, now God agrees. That's kind of like the big trump cards right there. That should give you a little bit of strength for quite a while to be able to think, God said this. And yet we still see so many times over the next 3 years how these guys failed. And we're all going to fail. We just need to try to keep on remembering that one thing that's so important. I was listening to another talk, actually it was The Chosen. And part of it was when they crossed the Jordan, and each of the tribes gathered up a rock, and they made an altar there for God. And it was something for them to remember. Something that if they ever questioned, they could go back to and they could say, this is how God got us here. And here we are now. We made it across the Jordan, and now it might be 10 years later. And you're wondering, is God with us? Is God helping us? Is God working? Where's God? we seem to be doing everything, and, where's God at? He's not doing what he used to do. And they could come back here, and they could say, this is what God has done for us. And it's so easy, as humans, we call it sometimes drifting away or whatever. We start to go our own path. We start to think about what we need to do for ourselves. And we miss out that this is what God did for us in the past. We don't have to try to do it for ourselves. What did God teach us? He taught us if we rely on him, he's the one that gets us across the Jordan River. He's the one that goes and conquers Jericho. He's the one that got us the rest of the promised land. And they built this so they could look back and remember that. And I think that that's something that we as Christians need to remember as well. Maybe we don't go out there and make a pile of rocks, but we could do a journal. We could do anything. I mean, if you take a look on the front porch, I have a rock that says Legacy on it. That came from that thing that me and my son went to probably at least 10 years ago at Camp Orchard Hill up next to Dallas, Pennsylvania. And the one thing we were talking about was a very similar thing. We were talking about a legacy rock that they had built. And we made that together, and that's to remind both of us of what we need to do. It's a rock that we have that I have kept for all these years. It was in storage for a while, but it's been, it's something that we can always look back on, and we can say, this is what we did, and this is what we talked about, and this is what we agreed on that weekend. And that's our legacy rock. And that's the kind of things that I think that we need to do as Christians, because there's so many times that God does wonderful things for us, and a day later, a week later, a month later, we're like, where'd you go, man? Where are you at? And we need to remember things like this. If we look at, I feel like I can talk extra long time. If we move on to 2 Peter, we can see that Peter remembers this time. And this is what he says here. We did not follow cleverly invented stories when we told you about the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For he received honor and glory from God the Father, when the voice came to him from the majestic glory, saying, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." We ourselves heard this voice that came from heaven when we were with him on the sacred mountain. Jesus remembers back to those days. And there's probably many times, especially the night that he denied Jesus 3 times, there's probably many times that Jesus totally forgot about that. That that Peter totally forgot about that. That Peter, as a man, failed. And he forgot that he heard God's voice. He forgot that he saw Jesus transform. It's funny, sometimes in Christianity we use big words like transfiguration. And all it basically means is he basically lit up and turned white and bright, and different kind of theories and thoughts on it. But it's when you look at how to explain it to a 4-year-old, they say just explain it as transforming. And he went from looking like this to getting a really bright face to looking like this to having really white clothing, and that's how you describe it to a kid. And it's like, it's really not that deep. It's really not that spiritual. The more I look into it, I could get various opinions on various things, but it's just the whole concept that God backed him up. This was God lighting Jesus up. This was God saying, this is my man, this is my son. Listen to him. And Peter and James and John got to witness that. And as I'm looking at the people that are sitting here, and I think everybody has had some kind of experience with God, that it's like, I know he did this awesome thing for me. And that is something that we need to take, and we need to build our roots, and we need never to forget. Just like the different things that happened in the Old Testament. Maybe rocks aren't the way nowadays, but we need to remember what he did for us And that's where we need to build our foundation. We need to build our roots, and we need to look forward. We need to look backward to see that, to guide us on the way forward. Thank you very much. You chill.